Well, hey, welcome to another episode of Digging Deeper. Robert here with the one, the only, Pastor Pete Goodman.
You know, actually, I don't even know if that's true. Sometimes you ever Google your name to see if there are other Robert
That's
Pedrozes?
true.
There are actually a lot of Pete
You're probably
Goodmans.
not the only Pete Goodman, but he's
I might be the only pastor of Pete Goodman, though. I'm not sure.
Are you? I don't know. We could always Google that
definitely
too.
not the only Pete
so
Goodman.
maybe Google it. Let us know in the
I
comments.
think there's a dentist in New York that shows up at the top when you Google it or something like that. I don't know. Not that I'm sitting there Googling myself all the time.
There's this dentist in New York, and he's got a wife and 4 kids. Just, I mean, not that I've checked or anything, but... Well, Pete, man, so week 2 of the series Calibrate, looking at the churches Smyrna and Pergamum, right? Those 2 different churches, and you started with a story that I want some more details about, and I'm sure a lot of other people do too, because you started with an exciting police chase.
Yeah, almost a police.
Almost a police chase.
It was exciting, though.
So you said this thing was a hopped up Mustang is what happened, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a car guy, you are, but it was nice. Like, it was shiny white. It was fast too. Like, he took off around me like he was cooking. Like, so he wasn't that far behind me, and he was top speed by the time he caught me. So that thing had some muscle. He was going fast. So,
okay, so I want to know, how crazy were you driving to keep up with it?
Okay.
And then
so
with your family in the car, Pete.
If you actually know, like, if you live in Santee, I was right by where Mary's Donuts is.
Oh, I do know.
And
where
I
you're at.
turned, so I had turned off of the road that goes in our neighborhood, which is there's a 7-Eleven there.
Yep,
and
I know
Estrada's.
exactly what you're talking about. Yep.
So like they were pulled over right by Estrada's, and he caught up to me right about Mary's Donuts. So if you think that's probably a quarter of a mile, he floored it.
Yeah.
And then he turned right at Mission Gorge and went out to the 125.
Okay.
So I got up to the stoplight at Mission Gorge and Carlton Hills, and he had turned right. I was going to go left. We we're going to In and Out. So that whole strip there is less than a mile.
For a second, I was like, man, what did you guys do to your Toyota Sienna to be able to keep up with a
So
hopped up Mustang?
I didn't keep up with him. I told the truth though. I literally, like, I was in the right lane and I could see him coming and going to the left lane to try to get past me. And I literally turned my car into the left lane, almost like, I want to say without thinking about it. I was thinking like, I want to slow this guy down so the cops can catch him. But he could have gone to the right lane and gone past me, but instead he kept going left and went into the oncoming traffic, went over the divider and went around me.
He went over the divider.
Yeah, there's a little bit, and he hit it. And so when he hit it, like some pieces flew off of his car, little pieces of plastic like flew up. So he did something to his car. And then, he just took off and went through the stoplight and headed out the highway.
So I want to know what everyone else wants to know. Did they catch him?
I don't know. So I have a friend who actually goes to Rise City, who is California Highway Patrol, and I actually found him yesterday. I'm like, dude, do you know anything about a white Mustang?
We need to know the final.
He didn't know. He hadn't heard anything
what
about
happened.
it. No.
Okay.
He was asking me, like, was that like Santee Sheriff? Did he get on the highway? I'm like, I actually don't know. There was another cop car coming towards us, though, who I think had already been radioed in. And he had done a U-turn and headed out that direction before I got to it.
This sounds exciting.
So I imagine there were probably 3 or 4 cops out in that vicinity. So I don't even know if he made it to the highway.
If you know, let us know.
Yeah.
We want to know. We want to know.
It was on Thursday of last week, which would have been, April 8th or 9th or something.
I love it. He's giving all kinds of details on this
I
one.
I want to know, too. My wife wanted to know.
This is exciting.
My wife is the person that watches all, the crime shows and the real, whatever. So she was like, I want to know if he got caught and stuff. And
that's awesome.
I'm kind of curious, too.
Speaking of your wife and kids, you opened that story by saying something that I was like, "What's going on, Pete?" Because you're like, "Well, I'm gonna make up for throwing my family under the bus last week."
Yeah.
Like, what do you mean?
2 weeks ago, I started with this whole. Sometimes, I get it in my head that there's an analogy that can come out of real life, and for me, it was not paying attention, and missing my turn is where I kind of started. And I'm like, I just got on a road trip with my kids. So when my kids were little, we had moved, before they were even born, we moved from Illinois to Kansas. Okay. And all of our family was still in Illinois. So when we had Kira, she was a baby, then we had Kellen, we would regularly, every 3 or 4 months sometimes, especially on holidays, be driving back. It's about an 11-hour drive. And what we would do when they were babies is we would drive through the night. So we'd leave at 8 p.m., kind of try to get them their car seats, hope they fall asleep, and then arrive, at 6 in the morning.
Yeah.
And it rarely worked. And so usually what happened, it'd be 2 in the morning. You're out in the middle of nowhere, middle of cornfields, and your babies are just screaming behind you. You can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
You just got to keep driving. So I got in the habit of putting in these in-ear monitor headphones that would just block it out, just to keep some sanity. Well, the reality is my kids have grown up. You know, my daughter's going to be 14 tomorrow. So we went on a road trip to Sedona. And the reality is, like, I put in my headphones, but it wasn't because they were being bad. At that point, it's just because I'm kind of bored. I'm used to it. It passes the time. But, you know, when I got on the stage, I thought, like, here's the thing. Pastors don't tell lies from the stage. They give sermon illustrations.
Dude, I feel triggered. Okay. No.
And I kind of embellished a little bit.
Sure.
But it was like, even in my embellishment, it was like, you know, get in the car. The kids are crazy. You want to tune them out. The reality is they weren't crazy on the trip to Sedona. They were actually really well behaved and calm. Gotcha. But so I think there was a little bit of like, hey, wait, we were fine. What are you saying that for?
Yeah, come on, Dad.
And to be honest, just being completely real, like, I think there's a part of it that just kind of like forgets, and time goes quickly. Like, yeah, they are older. Why did I say it? Like, and they were in the room, and so I kind of felt bad. And
yeah,
so it was like when we had a chance, and it was there's just a lot going on. So Thursday night we had some free. I'm like, let's just go out to dinner and let's go get some burgers or something. So that's where it's coming from.
Gotcha.
And my wife, you know, she understands, but she also was like, hey, I just, like, we had to have a talk on Sunday night, you know, or whatever, when we had a chance, like, of like, hey, I just want you to know, like, I wasn't crazy about that story, which is always a weird thing, you know. People maybe don't understand that, like my wife is hearing stuff along with everyone else for the first time, and sometimes she's like, wait, what?
Yeah.
And Brandon could, you know, I'm sure you could tell some stories
Sure.
too of like, this would be a great sermon illustration. And you don't think of like, well, how are my kids and wife actually feeling about what I'm saying to
Which is an important thing.
1,000 people right now? Yeah. And you got to be very cautious with that and careful. And sometimes you got to step back and apologize.
Yeah. I mean, even Easter Sunday, we did a little video where we put together, you know, all these different voices, and then God, Terrence Meehan, was talking back to those different things. And I was just reading a line that was there, but my line that I had to read was, you know, why isn't my family what I wanted it to be? My marriage is in shambles. My kids aren't behaving. I just picked it randomly. And my oldest daughter, Payson, is sitting next to me in one of the services, and she looks at me and she goes, what? You know, and I'm like, I explained to her, like, that wasn't about you guys. I just read a line.
That's funny. I didn't hear that.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
So sometimes you never know. You have to be really cautious about things.
Yeah. I've heard, like, you know, one of the hardest things is to be a preacher's kid, because your whole life is spread out in sermon illustrations. And there's truth to that, because when you're preaching, ultimately what you're trying to do is you're trying to help people connect the word of God to their life. So by bringing up things in my own life that the word of God connects to, I want to share it, but that's opening a doorway to a private life of some people that didn't give permission for that. And that can be hard. It can feel like you're always on, like you're always in a spotlight. You know, you and I don't preach every week. You know, Brandon's kids probably get the brunt of it, but all of them have to, like, work through that and be careful with it.
And it's a line you dance, right?
Yeah,
absolutely. To try to honor your family.
For sure.
So you looked at the Church of Smyrna and the Church of Pergamum.
Yeah, put them together.
And put them together, kind of talking through it. I had a few questions, just like reading through the text. And, you know, Revelation is one of those books that, man, there's a lot of interpretation that it goes in a lot of different directions when it comes to Revelation.
Sure.
For someone who is maybe following along, because I know that oftentimes, and if you don't do this, I would encourage you to do this, that as we're going through a series that's going through a portion of the Bible, which it always points to the Bible in some way, but when we're going through a specific section, you know, people want to read along and they study on their own and things like that. Give us a little bit of guidance on how should we read this section of Revelation, these letters to these churches. You know, I mean, there's a lot of different types of language in there. Let me give you an example. I mean, he says things that seem contradictory, like, I know your poverty, and yet you are rich, right? Like, so it's like, what does that mean? Also, like, things like, and I'd like to talk about some of these things specifically, but, you know, and for the Church of Smyrna, we know that they suffered for a while, but they're told you're just going to suffer for, it says 10 days.
10 days, yeah.
So this persecution is going to last 10 days. We know that it's more than that. So what could that possibly mean? Give us a little bit of insight on how should we actually approach this text, and how should we actually read it, study it, apply it to our lives?
Sure. Let me see where to start. That would be helpful here. If it's okay, we might go a little classroom here for a second.
I think that's helpful, actually. Yeah. We're digging deeper.
Okay, so whenever you pick up something like a book or a movie, we have a word that you might not use it, but you certainly know or understand it. It's the word genre. And the thing about genre is your brain has a way of automatically recognizing it.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I've kind of made this comment before, like you've told me you love like the Fast and Furious movies. Well, that's a genre, right? It's a very specific genre.
Yeah, it's like a fantastic action movie.
It's action. So what here? I want to get specific here.
I just see myself in those movies. That's all.
Yeah.
You know.
So, in the genre of the Fast and Furious, there are certain things that you would sort of expect to have happen, and then certain things that you wouldn't expect to have happen.
Yeah.
So, for example, when you're when you're watching Fast and Furious, it's okay that a tank is like flying out of the air and a guy jumps into it and steers it and lands it.
You mean
awesome.
better? Yes.
Okay, so there's a little bit of you're giving up a little bit of reality.
Yeah.
But here's the key.
A little.
No. Yes, you're only giving up a little bit of reality. If an alien showed up or a dragon flew out of nowhere,
you're right.
You'd be like, "What in the world just happened?"
Yes.
So the Fast and Furious is a little bit unrealistic, but it's not straight up science fiction or fantasy. When you're watching fantasy, you would expect a dragon to show up. You wouldn't expect a guy in a hot rod to show up.
Mm-hmm.
Like, well, that doesn't belong here. So when you're talking, and if you're reading the book Jane Eyre, right, by Jane Austen, you're expecting people to talk and dress a certain way and act. You're like a book like that is fiction, but it's based in history. So genre tells you what to expect.
Yeah.
And when your brain says this is what to expect, I can sift everything. I can look for things.
It's helpful.
And then there's another genre, which if you were to pick up a book like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis,
Mm-hmm.
well, now you're in a fantasy genre. So it's okay that there are elves and witches and and talking lions. They go into a fantasy realm. But you also know, because of what you've hopefully been told, and some people haven't, that the author, C.S. Lewis, was a Christian who was actually wanting to speak about a deeper world relating to Christianity. And so you're in fantasy land. So you have, these weird talking animals and magic and things. But you also know that C.S. Lewis is trying to represent ideas behind those pictures. So Aslan, the lion, for C.S. Lewis, represents Jesus and what he's done for us. And the witch represents evil in the world. And these kids are having to make decisions. So if you understand that, you can open up the Chronicles of Narnia and you can read it and enjoy reading it, but you have an idea what you're reading. So if you didn't know that, you would miss a lot of things. You might just think it's crazy fantasy land, which is still fun to read. There are people who read C.S. Lewis, don't know that he's a Christian doing behind the scenes ideas, and they still enjoy the book and enjoy it. So, but you know what you're getting into. So if you don't know what you're getting into, well, that changes everything, right? That everything becomes complicated. I've used this analogy before, and I think I might have used it in this podcast. I definitely teach it in my class. When I used to teach some of this to college students, I had this picture. It was an old picture from 1992. It was the cover of, I think it was like Time Magazine or Newsweek, and it was a cartoon of an elephant stomping on a donkey's head. And like the donkey, his like tongue was rolled out and his head was sideways.
Yeah.
And I said, what's going on here? And what was interesting is everyone in the room
knew what it was.
They're like, oh, it must be something political, like a Republican versus a Democrat. And I said, and probably I'm assuming the Republicans won an election. And I was talking like 18-year-olds who weren't like super intense, but they could tell, like, an elephant stomping on a donkey's head on the cover of a political magazine.
Great example. Yeah.
And I said, what if you took this and gave it to some people living in Zimbabwe? What would they think? What am I looking at? What is this, right? Without knowing that in my culture, elephants and donkeys and politics. So knowing what you're getting into, when you open the book of Revelation, the biggest challenge is before you even start reading, what are you getting into?
Yeah.
And why that's such a challenge is, number one, if it is donkeys and elephants, we aren't people that understand donkeys and elephants because it was written 2,000 years ago to different audiences. Or is it not donkeys and elephants? And is it actually supposed to be, I'm supposed to read this stuff and take it for what it says?
Yeah.
It doesn't tell me. It's not like the first sentence of Revelation is, oh, by the way, before you start reading, here's how to interpret this.
Yeah.
So even among Christians, there's not necessarily agreement. There are many believers, and I would put myself in this camp, who would say the best way to approach Revelation is to think of that example of elephants and donkeys. There's something highly political. There's something going on in their culture, in their world, and they're using symbols and analogies that they probably understood, but have been lost to us in many ways to history. Others would say, no, I don't think that's true. I think this book is for the modern age, and we're supposed to find ways to interpret and understand it in our current culture about the future, things like that. And both sides are intelligent, well-reasoned, well-meaning people. Yeah. Because it's so difficult, Rise City tends to shy away from taking a stance on it. I tend to shy away from taking a strong stance on it. I have an opinion. If I was on my podcast, I have, even my father-in-law, who is more educated than I am, has a different opinion on it. And it's like, okay, the church, throughout church history, Revelation has been a very hotly detested book.
Absolutely.
Revelation and Jude were like the last two that were sort of brought into the canon, because it was like, what do we do with these?
Yeah.
Revelation, and Jude were both written by apostles. So the early church was like, we can't not include a book written by the apostle John.
Pedigree and things.
But I don't know what the crumb he's talking about. So let's put it in and then maybe not, And so that being said, the opening of the letters to the churches appear to have the most easily digestible messages. And so for me to be able to cover them, once you get into chapter 4, and I actually brought up chapter 4 a little bit in my message, it really starts to get difficult to interpret. And so, I would say my interpretation of Revelation starts with these symbols, these picture words mean something, but their meaning is probably rooted in first century Asia Minor Roman Empire.
And the letters are helpful because they give us at least a geography of the contextual.
Yeah. So what was going on in Smyrna? And I did that a little bit, like this whole, like where Satan has his throne. Mm-hmm. Well, if you know geographically and historically that Pergamum was home to a temple built in the honor of Emperor Titus,
yes,
it can, I see what's happening here. If you know that the word Satan could be used as any adversary, not necessarily the devil, and actually he uses the word devil in other places. Mm-hmm. So a temple or a home of the adversary could easily be the Caesar, or it could have been Jupiter, the chief god, which was also in Pergamum. Pergamum was a tough place. So you start to get a sense of like, so these Smyrna in like too. Poverty, it's like, it's not just poor. This was happening in Smyrna. You're going to be covering Laodicea in a couple weeks.
Yeah,
and this whole hot and cold.
Exegesis with
there's
that
a
too.
lot there's a lot of historical context when you understand the city and where it was located. I would say all 7 of these letters have information in them that would have been relevant to their actual city. I'm doing Sardis in 3 weeks, and like there's so much going on in the history of Sardis that when he talks about living in your reputation, being asleep. They were a city that was attacked at night and didn't post guards. Mm-hmm. Like they were asleep. Like there's so much culture stuff. And so I think following all the way through, if you take that idea to the end of Revelation, you'll find that there's a lot of ways you can discover how certain symbols had cultural meaning in the first century.
Yeah.
But it's not for sure. You're still guessing.
So, I mean, that was a masterclass on how to read things in context and study and and really
be aware of what is at least the issue.
So amazing. And that was a great explanation of that. So I hope you feel equipped even through that. But let's talk about some of those specific examples then. Specifically, I think there might be some people that read this and are scratching their heads about those 10 days. What would that possibly mean? Just to kind of give us some application of how to apply that masterclass to the actual text here that we're reading. Mm. When it says 10 days, we know that they were persecuted for far longer than 10 days. They weren't just thrown in prison. It says, some of you will be put in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. What could that possibly mean? Is it really 10 days, or is it just talking about a short amount of time? Or
that's an interesting example. Yeah. Like of all the examples in Revelation, you actually pulled one that's really hard.
It's because
some are easier for me. A 10-headed dragon rising out of the ocean, to me, is like, look, even very literalist readers don't believe a dragon is going to run out of the ocean. Mm-hmm. Even they would say that must refer to something else. 10 days is like, that's very specific time period.
Very specific, yeah.
but I also know from history, I read from the stage the story of the Bishop of Polycarp, which happened around 150.
We know it's much longer than 10 days.
Which was, 60 years later.
Mm-hmm.
So they would continue to suffer for even more years after that. The real persecution would run up through the end of the 2nd century. So I would say 2 potential things. And then I'll sort of come back to the bigger point. First option is maybe John was giving a literal message to real people. And maybe there was somebody that he knew was going to read that letter that was going to be in prison for 10 days. It's very possible.
Yeah.
If so, then, well, it's not for all of us. It was just for those people. It's also very, I'll use the word likely, because I don't know, teeter-totter is bending one way a little bit. The word 10 has tons of significance because Rome was known as the city on 10 hills.
Mm-hmm.
So even the 10-headed dragon, the 10-headed beast, like the word 10 for a lot of people in the 1st century would evoke Rome. There's also, I think you even mentioned, some scholars have like counted, and there were 10 emperors before Diocletian, who was the last great persecution. So either way, 10 feels like it's probably saying Rome is going to keep coming at you. But it might not. And this is where I would come back to maybe the bigger deal. When I come to places like that,
that's where
the most important thing for me is this something to build theology around? And the answer is no. So I can build theology around stay faithful.
Yep.
Don't give in. Don't become, don't bow to idols. Suffering is part of life. Jesus even said his disciples would suffer. But 10 days, dragons, I'm not sure. And I don't hold too tightly to those things.
Which I think is important, because I think that people can read through Revelation and they can get hung up on some of this symbolic language that's, whether it's symbolic, literal, all the different ways that you can interpret some of this difficult language, let's call it that, within the text here. You can get hung up on those things and create entire doctrines based on a minutia moment within the scripture and miss the whole point of it. And so, so that's why I think it's so important that we're going through this series and we're really looking at what is the point of the correction or the encouragement to these churches. How do we apply it today to our church and to our own lives and so forth? And so for this specific message on Smyrna and Pergamum, it really was this idea of fight like heaven, right?
Yeah.
This idea of like, what does it look like to live like Christ would live in the middle of opposition? In the climate of persecution. What does it look like to do that? And then you kind of brought it home to where we live, right? We're not facing the persecution like they are. Like none of us are being, brought out and fed to lions or burned alive or anything like that. Nothing like that is happening from our government or anything like that. It's not as difficult to be a Christian as it was then. Let's not be delusional, right? Mm-hmm. But we do have some difficulty, and things feel like they are maybe heading in the wrong direction, in our perspective and things like this. And then we also have something coming up that some Christians, I think a lot of Christians will want to get involved in to some extent, this presidential election. Mm-hmm. And actually leading up to this message, you actually, you've kind of been in this rhythm that, and here's a behind the scene look, man. So you've been in a rhythm that during our staff meetings, you'll actually kind of share a little bit of a sermonette or an overview of your sermon before you give it on Sunday. And during the staff meeting, you kind of really honed in on some of your anticipation, your, let's call it fear, even maybe, of how Rice City Church, the people, will respond in light of this coming presidential election. Like, what is the climate going to look like based on how it looked last time? There's some concern for you. Explain that a little bit.
That's a lot to unpack. Let me take a half step back.
Okay.
And give you a little bit even where my brain was at so I started my message prep historical, right? I just started historical. I was just looking at some commentaries, some books that look into some of the ancient world, going back to some of my notes of classes I've taken. And I sort of said, okay, here are 3 things I see in this passage that were coming against them. And I sort of brought them together as like government, other people, culture, and technically it was the Jewish people, but I was like, I didn't interpret it, but I tried to make it practical in the sense of like, these were probably people that are close to you, people that you would expect to support you.
Yeah.
And then I said, well, okay. And this is maybe like something that I wrestled a little bit with, was there was this little side voice in my brain saying, man, we don't really suffer. Just tell people they're being dumb,
Oh, good.
But then I was like, well, that's not actually helping anyone,
because there is some suffering.
Instead of saying you guys are being dumb, they have it so much worse. I almost had this picture of a child being like, I don't want to eat this, and the parent being like, there's starving kids in Africa. It's like,
I use that line all the time.
Like, okay, it's true, but it doesn't actually address the situation we're facing right now.
Sure.
That you don't like peace. So I said, instead of doing that, how about I try to tone it down, but acknowledge, right? And then because I acknowledge it, and we can all acknowledge it, we know it's not as bad, but we still have to talk about how to work through what is reality. And if it's not practical, if it's not like, okay, something is happening, it's not as bad. But if I don't talk about it, then we don't actually talk about how to respond to what actually is happening.
That's right.
So what is happening is we did have a president who sent out a dumb tweet the day before Easter. And I use the word dumb, not just like I disagree with your politics, but dumb that like, even if I agreed with your politics, it's still the wrong time to send that tweet. You're goading people that shouldn't be goaded.
Yeah.
We do live in a state that is we look at Canada and see things they're doing and say, "Ooh, man, please don't let us become like that." Like people are literally saying, like, you can be tried for hate crimes and have your tax exempt taken away if you don't do certain things online. And there's that feeling or that sense, and so there's some realness there, and it begins to take root and come home at the election. So what I wish I had more time to do, and why I like the podcast, even though I wish everyone would listen to it so I can know they heard it. Here's my challenge, and it's all of our challenges. No one living in the first century understood democracy. They had a republic when their grandparents had a republic, but Julius Caesar blew it up. And even that wasn't real democracy. It was rich white men controlling everything.
Sure.
We live in a different setting and time and place where we shouldn't stand by silently and allow elected rulers to trample on what I think are rights of human beings, right? I actually do believe that as a citizen. Forget about being a Christian.
Yeah.
As a citizen, like I believe in a system of government where we're all involved, where we honor and respect each other and fight for the right to exist and hold your beliefs true to yourself. So there's a part of me that even if like, forget about like, being a Christian and Jesus and all stuff, like there's this part of me that says, okay, what does it mean to just be engaged in the public discourse and involved politically? There's nothing wrong with that. And I said that at the end. It probably got missed, whether people were angry or happy with what I was saying. But I said, there's nothing wrong with being involved politically. There's certainly nothing wrong with voting. I believe voting is what, should citizens vote? I mean, yeah, sure, be involved. I don't want to be a hypocrite because I didn't vote last time.
I would say, do you vote?
I have always voted until recently.
Okay.
But let me get into that.
Okay.
What bothers me, and I realize that someone might hear this and be like, "Oh, Pete's getting political." I can't not get political because it's a political issue, but it bothers me because of my religious beliefs. What bothers me is when people see things not going the way they want them to. There is a way to respond in the public discourse and things that is healthy and fine. But what Christians have done in the last 8 years is they've said, what we need is we need to fight like hell. So let's find somebody who will fight like hell for us in order to protect us. It doesn't get us the results we want long term. The church didn't grow because people acted like that. Christianity didn't flourish when Christians acted that way. Christianity flourished and grew when Christians just laid down their rights and said, we're not going to fight for it. We're just going to love people. And if it doesn't go our way, we're still going to love people. And that became attractive and actually changed people's minds. See, the thing is, what we're doing is, and this is all opinion. I'm not representing Rise Church. I'm just talking for myself.
Okay.
What we're doing is we're wanting to change the world by getting a bully to fight for us and change laws. But laws don't change people's hearts and minds. It doesn't actually change human beings. It doesn't change what we think.
Sure.
And it makes them harder. When somebody punches you and you punch back, all you're doing is escalating it. You're making things worse. Now both people are angry. And so the whole political thing over the last, 20 or 30 years has just been you punch, I punch harder, you punch harder, I punch harder. And the Christians have gotten involved in it. And it became our thing. We'll punch back hard. You punch us, we'll punch back harder. And no one is loving Jesus more because of that. It's not like Christianity is shrinking at an exponentially massive rate. Churches are dying left and right.
Yeah,
we're not winning. We're not making things better. No one is seeing the church get involved in this knockout, drag out, ugly political warfare and saying, man, I want to be a Christian. They're doing the opposite. Every time this stuff happens, I hear from people, and I'll sit with people. I used to be a Christian, not anymore. The way you people handle politics, I can't be a part of that. I hear that way. I've never heard anyone say, I was an atheist, but man, the way that you guys have responded in the last 8 years,
convinced.
I just got to follow this Jesus guy. No, I've never heard anyone say that.
I want to kind of get down to that too, because listen, whatever particular candidate someone advocates for or votes for, I'm okay with it. But what I have seen be really destructive is oftentimes the way that people advocate or argue for their specific candidate or their political stance.
There's an anger and
also it gets really personal.
It does.
It gets really personal to the point where I've heard things like you can't think that way politically and still call yourself a Christian. Like it gets extreme in those moments, and it can actually set brother against brother and family against family. And I'm not talking about in the way that Jesus and our allegiance to him can polarize us. I'm talking about politically, our allegiance goes towards some other viewpoint, and that's our source of polarization. Man, what does it look like for a Christian, aside from advocating for any particular candidate? What does it look like for a Christian to be a responsible citizen, to maybe be involved in the political process in a responsible, good citizenship type of way, and yet also represent Christ well? Especially, here's what I think is a key thing, especially to those that you disagree with, because oftentimes that's where the barrier comes up, and it's like, man, I don't even, and yet God is like calling us, no, you reach across the barrier and you love people where they're at, right? Like you break down those things and you build bridges instead. What does it look like for a Christian to build bridges in a political climate that would want to divide parties? What does it look like for a Christian to actually be a unifying factor rather than a divisive one?
Man, that's tough. We'll get into this more on Sunday. As we talk about the next church. I had a phrase that when I was starting this message, sometimes I like title my messages.
Yeah.
And I didn't actually end up using this title. I went a different direction. My phrase was, be odd, but not at odds.
Yep.
And
I know
Jesus was
group notes.
Jesus was odd, but not at odds. And you say, well, Jesus had some pretty mean things to say. And I talk about, he's like, yeah, but who did he talk to? Who was he mean to? When Jesus had mean things to say, it was almost always to his fellow religious people who were coming at him. He didn't. I mean, it wasn't to like the stranger, the outcast. Like, I mean, he didn't talk. I don't see him talking to Romans that way. Actually, it was like an internal dialogue thing. Yeah, he was having a difficult conversation with his brothers and sisters who shared his beliefs, but he was definitely odd. He was weird. He at no point was he like, oh, the Romans want me to do that. Okay, I'll do that. No, he was fine saying, no, that's not what we're going to do. That's not who I am. I'm not going to do that. But he didn't have to like punch anyone or like, right. So even what he was like, and I know it's difficult and trying to make it practical, but like, if I can't be oddly committed to beliefs that the culture doesn't like and still love people, then Christianity doesn't work. So like none of it works. The whole point of Christianity is calling me to be different and distinct and odd but still love people.
I like that.
And if I can't do that, then the whole thing's nonsense. But I can do that because Jesus did that. And then he called me to follow him. So I would just say, like, in my own life, I have to admit right off the bat, partly because I work at a church and partly because I'm a massive introvert. I don't have a ton of relationships with people that aren't maybe like Christians. As a pastor, I a lot of my free time ends up spending with people that want to talk about pastor things.
Yeah.
But but I do connect with people that aren't. I'm not fighting with anybody. I don't get online and fight with people. I don't comment on people's posts. Like I don't personally feel like I can't like tell people what I believe without being a jerk and feel like I have to war with them.
Yeah, that's good. Because it's misplaced strength.
What do you mean by that?
I like, let's use a boxing analogy, right? There's two ways that you can show strength when you're a boxer. You can have a powerful, strong punch.
Like Tyson?
Yeah. Or you can have a really powerful, strong chin. You can take a punch.
Oh, wow.
Right? And so the call of Jesus is to have a strong chin, right? Turn the other cheek.
There's an old Simpsons episode where Homer, like, I think wins the boxing championship because he can just keep punching him in the head and he doesn't feel it.
but it's that shows strength.
He can't beat him. The guy just gets tired of swinging at him.
That's a little weird too. But that shows strength just as much.
Yeah.
If you can take, if you can take a punch, it shows strength, right? Right? And so oftentimes Jesus is saying, no, I want to fortify, edify, build you up to be strong so you can be firmly planted on a firm foundation, because your strength actually isn't even from you. Mm-hmm. In fact, his strength is perfected in our weakness when we decide, I'm going to depend on you because I'm this strong tower, so that when the waves come against you, like, I'm going to hold you firm in your place, and so you're not going to be movable. And so you can stay firm to your convictions and what God calls you to be and what God calls you to believe in and stick to. But at the same time, you're not aggressively a puncher, right? Mm-hmm. Where you're trying to like punch everyone else around you that doesn't agree with you and doesn't want to hold the same stance that you do. Like, your strength and ultimately Christ's strength is displayed best in your ability to be immovable within a culture that's constantly trying to move you, not necessarily trying to push culture around like a bully. That's kind of what you're saying.
Yeah, I think if you're going to follow that analogy, I would say, like, one is fighting like hell and one is fighting like heaven, because the model of Jesus was to take it. Like, that's the cross.
Yes, it is.
That is the cross is, if you're the king of the Jews, call upon angels and take yourself off this cross. Well, he could have. He was God. He could have just said a word and all the Roman soldiers would have been dead and lightning would have, like, he could have stopped all of it. And
even in the beginning of his ministry, when Satan came and tempted him,
and
he said, if you're hungry,
right,
turn these into bread, and
the
he
temptation
was,
was preparing him for what was going to come in the end of, like, will you be willing to suffer? Because the plan, and there's this great moment. Oh man, I'm going to preach now. There's this great moment where Satan says, he shows him all the kingdoms of the earth. He says, I'll give you all of this if you bow down to me. Mm-hmm. And what I think so fascinating about that passage is, if I'm Jesus, I have to assume he already knew he was going to get all that land as king. He knew he was king.
He created it.
Right. But like, what Satan was offering him was something that he was already going to get. But what Satan was offering was the ability to skip the pain and suffering. Like, God's plan for you to have glory and victory is a cross. Follow my plan. Come and fight like hell, and I'll give you everything you want. Don't follow God's plan of suffering and pain, and it's scary. It's fearful. Right. It doesn't look the way you want it to look. Things don't go. It's not comfortable. You feel, it doesn't feel good, and it's like, but that's actually where victory lands.
And that's where real strength is.
Yeah, and I think what's hard is when you're talking about this, there's so many. If someone was saying all this, I go, what about this? What about that? And there's so many what ifs and what ifs, should the Allies not have punched back at Hitler, things like that. And I'm like, look, first of all,
what does it look like to stand up for those that are marginalized?
God has, and maybe if I could just sort of step, the Bible says that God has ordained, meaning given authority to governments in order to protect the weak and administer justice. So I'm not a pacifist. I'm not actually. And I want people to hear that. I am not a pacifist. Like, if a state needs to engage in violent activity to protect people, like, so be it. My opinion, my reading of scripture is God has given the state the sword to make that decision. So even as a Christian, if my job is to be a police officer or a military person or something, that's not what I'm talking about right now. I'm talking about living my life as a normal person, feeling like I have to fight battles to protect, constantly push back and fight back and get what I want. That's the issue. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean,
to chase down the Mustang.
Yeah, right. It's chase down the Mustang. Good example. There are people who are supposed to chase down the Mustang who are the ones that know how to do it. They're equipped to do it. They're the right ones to do it. I'm not the right one to do it.
Yeah.
So like, I think like where that meets with politics is very hard because technically I'm supposed to vote, right? It's nothing wrong with me being involved in politics. Could I just kind of land this plane though here? I know it's getting late.
Yeah.
And I hope people are still listening at this point. The purpose, the goal, the end, what am I doing here of this sermon series is not trying to be like, hey, you guys suck, don't do this wrong. It's just to say, look, there are things in our future that have the potential to get our church a little off course.
Yep.
And one of the things that can get us off course is if as a church, we take our eyes off of being a loving and life-giving church that brings hope and healing in Jesus' name, and we just start to focus too much on politics and suffering and all the things going wrong. I'm not saying they're not there. I'm not saying that maybe as concerned citizens, sometimes there's ways to be involved in a healthy way. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying as a church, I don't want us to fall in that trap of being all about politics and elections and all that. Like every time we meet on a Sunday, it's, oh, things are so bad out there. Like we know things are bad out there. We're called to be a light to do something about we're called, but the way we're called to do something about it is by loving our neighbors and being hope and healing, not being more violence. So this message series is not, hey, if you support Trump, you're a bad Christian. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not at all. Like, I understand. It's more saying as a church, we're not going to be about that. It's not our mission. It's not what we're aiming at.
Yeah.
And if we're getting too far that way, I want us to course correct and say, no, we're about hope and healing. If there are parts of the being engaged in public discourse that are healthy and bring hope and healing, let's talk about it. But for the most part, like, it's just, I don't know. It hasn't shown itself to bear fruit.
I think that, if we're to close this out too, as we head into this next political season that's coming, it's coming, whether we like it or not, we can choose to really fulfill that vision of being a loving and life-giving people who would bring hope and healing in Jesus' name. We can choose to do that, and that's all about relationship, or we can choose to make sure that everyone knows that we're right.
Yeah.
And I think that we have a choice going into this season. Do we want to be people that are known for our love, that are loving people even that we disagree with, because we're prioritizing relationship first and foremost with Jesus and then with other people, right? Are we loving God with our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and then loving our neighbor as ourselves? Is that the type of people we are? Or are we people that are just right? That we know better than everybody else? And I implore that we be a church that would be the former.
Yeah.
That would be people that would love God and love other people. And then if there's things that we disagree about, okay, I find that redirection is something that happens best in relationship anyway.
Yeah.
Right? Not in a Facebook post, right? Not in a picket sign on a street corner that's hurling an insult at someone else too, like really, if you want to redirect in a really healthy way, okay, there might be some things that God calls you to do that for. I don't know, right? I think it happens most effectively in relationship.
Yeah.
And so let's be people that would do that would wake up, rise, and shine. I mean, to really bring us home, that would be loving and life-giving. Because that's the thing. Our vision statement isn't that Rise City Church becomes a place that's loving and life-giving, that you get hope and healing at. That is definitely part of it. But it really is that we would become the church, the who, and the who is the people of Rise City Church, that we would become people that are loving and life-giving, who would bring hope and healing that's only found in Jesus' name. Yeah. That's our focal point. That's our calibration, parameter. That's what we need to calibrate to. That's our true north that we need to keep on pointing back to. And so I really appreciate that, man. But
a
yeah,
long one, but
man.
it's good.
But I'll tell you what, we definitely dug deeper today.
Yeah, we did.
So I mean, Pete even he uncovered some dirt that I was like, whoa, okay. Not dirt. He got deeper than I thought he would get.
Oh, gotcha.
That's what I meant to say. Not dirt, but yes. That was a poor choice of words, and I did not mean that. But yes. Anyway, he exposed a little bit more of the way his brain thinks and some of his own stances on different things more than I expected, which is okay. But at the end of the day, man, I think that's so important that we as a church, we be loving and life-giving. We focus on bringing hope and healing in Jesus' name. So
Let's do it.
Awesome. We'll see you guys next time on Digging Deeper.
Thanks, everybody.